In this chapter, we are going to learn how to use multiple workers with a data loader. This is useful because we can now speed up the data loading process. So really, we are going to talk about this section in the documentation here. Let's consider a data set whose index at 0 gives us an element of all zeros, index at 1 gives us an element of all ones, index at 2 gives us element of all twos, and so on. Let's refresh our memory on what happens when there are no additional workers and all the data loading is happening in the same process as the training. Now, as we have seen before, we have the train.py that instantiates the data loader, which in turn instantiates the batch sampler and the data set. And all of these components are part of the same execution process. When train.py calls next on the data loader's iterator, the data loader is going to ask the batch sampler for the indices of the first batch. And if you're using a sequential sampler with a batch size of 3, that's going to be 0, 1, and 2. The data loader is then going to ask the data set to fetch the data at index 0, and then at index 1, and finally at index 2, and collating the first batch and sending it on its way to train.py. And when train.py calls next again on the data loader's iterator, the same set of steps are repeated again for the second batch, whose indices in this case will be 3, 4, and 5. The data loader will ask the data set to fetch the data at these indices, collate the second batch, and then send it on its way to train.py. Now let's see all of this in action. First, I'm going to do the usual imports. cprint is a little utility that I wrote to print in color. We will use this utility to print the output from different processes in different color so we can distinguish between them. You can download this utility from PyPI and pip install it using pip install avilab utils-cprint. All right, let's finish importing and instantiate the random numbers generator that we will use to generate the target values in our dataset. This is a log function that we will use to print what different components like the dataset, the batcher, the data loader, etc. are doing. Now let's implement a toy mapped dataset, something that we've done a number of times already in this tutorial. The only difference is that in the getItem method, we will log which data index is being fetched. The rest of the implementation is pretty straightforward. The x value is just a vector of the same number as the index, and the y value is randomly chosen to be either 0 or 1. And now, as per the dataset specification, we implement the len method, and then we're done with our implementation of this toy dataset. Now we'll implement our own custom batcher, and this is nothing but a wrapper on top of the default batch sampler. And I'm doing this so that I can log every time it's being called to yield another batch. Now in our main function, we will instantiate the data set, the data loader with our custom batcher using a sequential sampler and a batch size of 3. Now, as the main function iterates through the data loader, it will log the data that it got, and then it'll pause. It'll wait for us to press enter before fetching the next batch of data. This will help us see the entire data fetching flow in action. Now let's run this program and see what happens. Here we can see that the process ID of this process is 89873. If you're following along, your process ID will obviously be different. Here is our custom batcher yielding the first batch. Our dataset fetches the data in the first batch. The main function prints the data that it just got and then waits for me to press enter. And as soon as I press enter, the entire cycle repeats with the second batch.